Hello, I'm Dr. Pam Berry from the Environmental Change Institute, where I lead the Biodiversity and Climate Adaptation Group. In MaRIUS, I'm particularly involved in leading the work stream looking at the impacts of drought and water scarcity on ecosystems and their ecology. There are two groups looking at this, the Environmental Change Institute and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, but I'm going to be talking about the work that we're doing here in Oxford at the Environmental Change Institute. Looking at the impacts of drought and water scarcity on ecosystems and their component species is quite challenging. There are a number of ways of trying to approach this. And in MaRIUS, we're using a range of different modelling approaches to try and address this problem. The Centre for Ecology and Hydrology are primarily looking at aquatic and wetland habitats and species, and are using a range of modelling techniques based on river flows, characterising flow regimes and river morphologies in order to try and understand how different rivers might be vulnerable in the future and how the species within them might be at risk. Here at the Environmental Change Institute, we're adopting two different methods for trying to look at the impacts of drought and water scarcity. To start with, we're using a well-tested technique, which is species distribution modelling or species climate envelope modelling, which has a look at the existing distribution of species in their relationship with climate and looks to see how that relationship might change in the future under different climate scenarios, or in the case of MaRIUS, different future drought scenarios. And so what we can do here is to take a range of species which are associated with different habitats, and in particular we're looking at wetland, grassland and woodland habitats, and for each of these habitats select species which are dominant or characteristic of the habitat, as well as selecting some species which are perhaps of conservation interest. And having applied the species distribution models, and here we're using an ensemble of models in order to try and capture some of the model uncertainty, we then obtain maps of where there would, based on current relationships with climate, be suitable climate space in the future. So this is much more about trying to capture climate change impacts and water scarcity impacts rather than drought per se. And here on the screen you can see the suitable climate space for the 2050s, at the moment just using the UK CP09 scenarios, for three species which are typical of wetlands. And on these maps, the green represents where there will be suitable climate space in the future, and the browny buff colour shows where there will be no suitable climate space in the future, at least under the 2050s scenario. And so you can see here that southeast England through into the central England will be vulnerable to losing suitable climate space for the ragged robin and for the marsh marigold. And if you look at the reed bunting, you can see that it's only going to be the northern parts of England which would have suitable climate space. And what we're going to do in order to try and understand the impact on wetlands as a whole is to have a look at the whole range of species that we've modelled for the habitat, and to think about their role in the habitat, how they affect the functioning of the habitat, and from that we can then make some statements about the habitat as a whole and how it might be affected by climate change and its associated water scarcity. But we also want to find other approaches for looking at the impacts of drought on ecosystems, and this is quite challenging as far as we can find, there are no sort of ready-made models out there. But what we are exploring at the moment is using a dynamic global vegetation model called LPJ-GESS, which works particularly for different types of woodland, and which then looks at how woodlands function, and then from the model we can derive various parameters such as productivity, leaf area index, and potentially a tree mortality index. And so what we have done as an exploratory study is to look at the Thames catchment and to run the model for the last 30 or so years to see how the existing patterns of climate and water have affected tree mortality. And what you can see on the screen here is areas which are shaded in green where there's no or virtually no mortality predicted for that year, but the areas showing orange and red are showing where there is a higher predicted mortality for that year. And so what we can see is that there is interannual variation in the predicted mortality. In particular, if you look at the top left-hand picture, you can see that there are one or two areas of dark orange, and of course this is the year following the 1976 drought, and thus we might expect higher mortality then. So that is one thing we are able to do. The model also enabled us not only to look at what was happening to tree mortality as a whole, but also certain tree species are characterized within the model. And so we can start to see how they might respond to drought, because the drought undoubtedly will be species specific. So what we have here are two locations in the Thames Basin, and the graph at the top shows the calculated standard precipitation index, the sort of drought index for the two sites, and you can see that it's very, very similar. And what's quite clear is the drought of 1976 is shown as a trough in the graph. If you look at the two graphs below, then you can see on the green line the response of oak, the English oak, and how that might have an elevated mortality response at site 1 compared to the red line, which is the mean for all the tree species. And then on the blue line you have beech, which is showing a very low mortality response, and this is probably even more marked on the bottom graphic. Now this is something that needs very careful investigation, because using species distribution modelling and work done by other people, beech has been shown to be very responsive to drought, very sensitive, and thus, given these are preliminary results, this is something we need to go back and look at more carefully. But at least here, in using a dynamic global vegetation model which uses the functioning of species as part of the modelling, we have an alternative approach to trying to address the challenge of the impacts of drought and water scarcity on ecosystems. Thank you very much for listening.